The morning air hangs heavy over a shattered French crossroads. Dust settles slowly on the leaves of roadside trees, stirred only by the distant vibration of engines that never seem to stop. Maps are spread across a wooden table inside a requisition farmhouse. German officers lean in close, their fingers tracing red and blue lines that no longer make sense. For weeks, the calculations had been clear. Roads destroyed, bridges blown, rail lines cut by Allied bombers. Any modern army, stretched this far from its ports, should have been forced to halt. That was how wars were supposed to work. Yet beyond the window, the evidence keeps moving. American trucks roll east in unbroken columns, their canvas tops dark with dust and rain. Fuel tankers, ammunition carriers, mobile repair units, each follows the next with mechanical regularity. There are no pauses, no visible shortages, no signs of exhaustion. German commanders had expected a lull, a moment to regroup, a chance to rebuild defensive lines behind the Seine. Instead, reports arrive faster than they can be processed. American units are advancing on multiple axes at once. 3 separate armies, all moving forward, all supplied. The assumption of Allied overreach, long held and carefully reasoned, begins to fracture. And in its place forms a quieter, more unsettling question: how long can this possibly continue? That question will shape every decision that follows. The summer of 1944 had already transformed the map of Western Europe. On June 6, Operation Overlord had begun, the long-feared invasion of Normandy. Beaches once guarded by concrete bunkers and barbed wire now bore the marks of relentless bombardment. Omaha, Utah, Juneau, Sword, and Gold, names that would soon be etched into history, had become the initial footholds for what the Allies hoped would be a decisive campaign. But landing on the beaches was only the beginning. The real challenge was the terrain beyond, the narrow, winding roads of the French countryside, punctuated by destroyed bridges and mined fields. The Allies had anticipated resistance, but the scale and tenacity of German defenses exceeded many predictions. Each village had become a fortified point, each river crossing a choke point. Beyond the immediate front lines, the logistical picture was grim. French rail networks, once efficient veins carrying men and material, lay in ruins from relentless Allied air attacks. Roads that had once carried civilian traffic were cratered, blocked, or destroyed entirely. The Germans assumed that these limitations would stall the Allied advance, perhaps even grind it to a halt. Yet, despite these obstacles, American planners had prepared for contingency after contingency. General Dwight D. Eisenhower and his staff understood that victory in Normandy depended not just on boots on the ground, but on the ability to sustain those boots with constant supplies. Engineers had begun clearing roads even as combat raged, bridging destroyed crossings and laying temporary tracks. Depot systems were established as far forward as safely possible, moving closer with each liberated village. Supply convoys became a lifeline, stretching from the beaches deep into French territory, a network of steel and fuel that defied German expectations. The Germans, meanwhile, were reacting. Intelligence reports consistently noted the extraordinary rate at which American forces were advancing. Field commanders, accustomed to seeing overextended enemies falter, began documenting the miracle of supply. Yet from their vantage point, the Americans seemed to draw resources from nowhere. Reports from forward posts described endless columns of trucks, mobile kitchens, and fuel tankers rolling over roads the Germans believed impassable. Every setback was met not with delay but with a seemingly inexhaustible American response. Behind the scenes, the organizational structure of the U.S. forces played a decisive role. The 1st, 3rd, and 9th Armies were not just advancing, they were coordinated, synchronized, and supplied through an intricate system that combined planning, flexibility, and sheer industrial capacity. Supply officers used every tool available. Captured ports were repaired rapidly, temporary depots were constructed near the front lines, and truck convoys were maintained under constant rotation. Even the destruction caused by retreating German forces was mitigated by American ingenuity. Bridges were replaced with Bailey Bridge sections within days. Bombed rail yards were rerouted through truck convoys. The scale of these operations cannot be understated. Thousands of trucks were moving day and night, carrying tens of thousands of tons of fuel, ammunition, and provisions. Soldiers on the front lines, accustomed to shortages in other theaters of war, were stunned to find their units consistently equipped, fed, and reinforced. German officers, observing these developments, were forced to adjust their own strategies, but each adjustment revealed new weaknesses in their defensive plans. The more they tried to anticipate American needs, the more they discovered that the U.S. logistical machine operated on a scale and speed they had not imagined possible. Even within the Allied command, there was awareness that the logistical challenge was immense. Every mile of road, every captured port, every forward depot had to be maintained against both the elements and enemy action. Supplies had to arrive not just on time, but in the correct order. Ammunition for artillery, fuel for vehicles, rations for men, and repair parts for broken machinery. A single bottleneck could stall the advance of entire armies. Yet, through careful planning and improvisation under pressure, American logistics officers managed to keep the flow steady and relentless. By late August, the Germans were observing what appeared to be a logistical paradox. How could an army, spread across hundreds of kilometers of contested territory, remain fully supplied? Reports filtered up to the high command, painting a picture of a force that moved with unprecedented speed and efficiency. It was not magic. It was method, discipline, and the practical application of industrial power in the field. And as American troops pushed deeper into France, liberating towns and capturing key positions, the initial assumption that the Allied advance would stall collapsed. The Germans had expected a pause, a moment to regroup, perhaps even a counteroffensive opportunity. Instead, what they saw was a continuous push forward, sustained by a network of supply lines so effective that it stunned even experienced commanders. This relentless movement, powered by logistics, would soon redefine how the German leadership understood the capabilities of the American armies and set the stage for the next phase of the campaign. As the Allies moved beyond Normandy, the scale of the operation expanded dramatically. The breakout from the beaches, Operation Cobra, had created a gap in the German lines, offering the U.S. 1st, 3rd, and 9th Armies the opportunity to advance into the heart of France. Yet the terrain itself posed a challenge. Hedgerows, forests, rivers, and bombed-out towns made movement unpredictable. Roads were narrow, often reduced to a single lane by rubble, and bridges had been blown to slow the advance. For most armies, these obstacles would have been a crippling bottleneck. The American command recognized the risk immediately. Eisenhower, General Omar Bradley, and General George S. Patton coordinated closely with supply and logistics officers to ensure that mobility was not just maintained but accelerated. Central to this effort was the development of an unprecedented transport network. The Red Ball Express, composed primarily of African-American truck drivers, became the backbone of the operation. Hundreds of trucks, each carrying essential supplies, ran round-the-clock routes from captured ports such as Cherbourg to the advancing front lines. Convoys traveled in convoys of hundreds of vehicles, often under threat from enemy artillery and air attacks, yet the system proved remarkably resilient. The Germans, on the other hand, underestimated the speed at which the Americans could recover and repair infrastructure. Their defensive strategy assumed that destruction of key transport routes, roads, bridges, railways, would inevitably slow the Allied advance. German intelligence reports repeatedly noted the Americans' apparent disregard for these obstacles. Where one army might have stalled, American engineers swiftly repaired bridges using modular Bailey bridges. Cratered roads were filled and leveled within days, and detours were established before the Germans could react. Simultaneously, the Allies' use of rail, pipelines, and depots allowed for redundancy. Fuel, a constant limiting factor in mechanized warfare, was delivered not only by trucks, but also through temporary pipelines laid across liberated territory. Ammunition and spare parts were stockpiled in forward depots, carefully placed to support multiple army corps simultaneously. This meant that even if one supply line were attacked or disrupted, alternative routes could sustain the fighting units without interruption. German commanders, who had anticipated logistical breakdowns, found themselves confronting the reality of an army that appeared to draw strength from nowhere. Coordination at the highest levels of command ensured that the logistical efforts were synchronized with combat operations. Bradley's Corps and Patton's Third Army operated along separate axes, yet their supply networks overlapped and reinforced one another. Eisenhower's strategic oversight maintained a continuous flow of resources, balancing the needs of the front lines with the limitations of ports and roads. Unlike the Germans, whose supply chains were fragmented and reactive, the Allies operated proactively, predicting requirements weeks in advance. German field commanders, observing this unprecedented logistical efficiency, were increasingly stunned. Reports from the front described entire divisions moving faster than expected, with fuel, ammunition, and rations always arriving in sufficient quantity. Attempts to ambush supply lines were largely unsuccessful. Americans repaired damage almost as quickly as it occurred. Even small towns that should have slowed the advance became hubs of movement, repurposed into temporary depots, repair stations, or staging areas. The psychological impact on German leadership was profound. Officers, who had served through campaigns in Poland, France in 1940, and the Eastern Front were unaccustomed to facing an enemy whose operational tempo was matched by the unbroken reliability of its logistical network. Orders for defensive maneuvers were constantly revised, as intelligence arrived too late to anticipate supply-driven advances. Confidence in the ability to contain the Americans began to erode, replaced by a growing sense of inevitability. The broader strategic context amplified this effect. While the Germans struggled to understand how American logistics sustained three entire armies simultaneously, the Allies were already planning the next phase: rapid movement across France toward the Rhine. Supply networks were pre-positioned, forward repair units were deployed, and logistical officers calculated tonnage requirements for each advancing division. Every American advance was not just a military maneuver, but a calculated demonstration of industrial and organizational superiority. By early September 1944, German reports described the American supply efficiency as almost mythical. Commanders acknowledged that even if they regrouped, the pace and resilience of the Allied advance left little hope for effective counteraction. The initial assumption that destruction of infrastructure would halt the Americans had failed. Instead, what the Germans faced was an unstoppable momentum, fueled not only by manpower and firepower, but by the quiet, unrelenting machinery of logistics. This understanding of the Americans' operational capacity, grounded in precise supply and coordination, would soon become the central factor shaping German strategic decisions, and set the stage for the multifaceted angles through which this campaign would unfold. Human angle. The drivers and engineers along the winding roads of liberated France, the human element of the logistical effort became unmistakable. Convoys of trucks stretched as far as the eye could see, engines humming in synchrony, carrying fuel, ammunition, and food to the front lines. At the heart of this operation were the drivers, many African-American soldiers, whose role was as critical as that of the soldiers on the battlefield. Known collectively as the Red Ball Express, These men worked around the clock, often sleeping only a few hours between shifts. They navigated treacherous roads, repaired minor mechanical failures in the field, and braved artillery fire and ambushes, ensuring that frontline units remained fully supplied. The engineers who followed closely behind were equally vital. Bailey bridges rose overnight over destroyed rivers, trucks were repaired in temporary roadside garages, and damaged roadways were leveled using whatever materials were at hand. Their work was silent, rarely highlighted in official dispatches, but it was the lifeblood of the advancing armies. German reconnaissance often reported these movements with disbelief. The enemy could see the Americans advancing, but the scale and efficiency of the human machinery behind it remained almost invisible until it struck decisively. Tactical angle. Sustaining the advance from a tactical perspective, logistics dictated the pace of combat operations. Commanders planned offensives with the certainty that ammunition, fuel, and reinforcements would arrive precisely when and where they were needed. This allowed American generals to maintain continuous pressure on German forces, denying them opportunities to regroup. Each division's forward movement was synchronized with supply deliveries, and contingency plans accounted for every potential disruption. German units, accustomed to exploiting temporary supply shortages, found their traditional tactics ineffective. The Americans could advance along multiple axes simultaneously because their logistics removed the usual constraints of distance and terrain. German intelligence angled German field intelligence was increasingly confounded. Initial reports assumed that the Americans' advance was slowing due to logistical limitations, as had been standard in prior campaigns. However, reconnaissance observed trucks moving steadily along repaired routes, fuel depots replenished faster than anticipated, and soldiers supplied without delay. Reports to the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht reflected astonishment, with officers describing the Americans as unrealistically well-provisioned. Analysts struggled to identify the weak point that would halt the advance. Every attempt to predict shortages or ambush supply lines failed, forcing commanders into defensive postures. This created a psychological imbalance. German plans became reactive rather than proactive, and the front lines began to shift under constant pressure. Psychological/moral angle. The psychological effect of American logistical superiority cannot be overstated. German soldiers and officers alike experienced a growing sense of frustration and disbelief. Units that expected to catch advancing Americans in vulnerable positions found their adversaries continuously reinforced. Commanders became hesitant, uncertain of their own assumptions, and aware that the enemy possessed not only manpower and firepower, but also a support system that rendered traditional attrition tactics ineffective. Morale on the German side faltered subtly but steadily, as the perception of American invincibility spread from reports to lived experience in the field. The combination of these angles, the relentless human effort, the tactical synchronization, the intelligence failures, and the psychological strain, began to define the campaign. Each element reinforced the other. Skilled drivers enabled tactical flexibility. Successful tactical movements confirmed intelligence reports. Intelligence failures deepened moral and psychological shocks. By late August and early September 1944, the Germans faced a multifaceted reality. The Americans were not merely advancing. They were sustaining 3 entire armies at a tempo that defied expectation and challenged every preconception of warfare. This foundation sets the stage for the next set of angles, highlighting technological innovation, leadership strategy, and the long-term moral impact of this logistical feat. By early September 1944, the scale of the Allied advance had reached a point that German commanders could no longer ignore. 3 U.S. armies, 1st, 3rd, and 9th, were moving simultaneously across northern and eastern France. The audacity of this maneuver lay not just in the number of troops deployed, but in the logistical network that sustained them. German officers, stationed in command posts hastily established in bombed-out chateaus or commandeered town halls, were confronted with a reality that defied prior military experience. The Americans did not pause, and they did not falter. Reports flooded the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht. Red Ball Express convoys, running around the clock, delivered thousands of tons of fuel, ammunition, and rations. Trucks, armored and reinforced, navigated roads considered impassable only weeks prior. Forward depots, replenished daily, ensured that artillery and infantry units never waited for essential supplies. Eisenhower's planners had anticipated every disruption. Every destroyed bridge was bypassed or rebuilt. Every mined road cleared with efficiency that stunned even veteran engineers. German officers could only watch as the logistical puzzle, seemingly impossible to sustain, functioned with unerring precision. The German reaction was immediate and disorienting. Commanders at corps and division levels attempted to slow the American advance with counterattacks and ambushes. Tanks were positioned at choke points. Artillery batteries rained fire on advancing columns. Yet, each intervention was met with the same result. The Americans adapted. Convoys rerouted, engineers repaired damage in hours, and combat units pressed forward. Intelligence reports describe the disbelief in stark terms. Impossible to believe, beyond comprehension, and supplies arrive faster than they can be destroyed. The language reflected not exaggeration, but genuine astonishment. On the front lines, soldiers reported seeing entire divisions advance with unbroken strength. Units that might have been isolated or weakened under normal circumstances maintained cohesion. Fuel for tanks, artillery shells for bombardments, and rations for men arrived consistently. Each day, German forces expected to exploit gaps, only to find that the Americans had already anticipated potential shortages and corrected them preemptively. This operational tempo created a sense of inevitability. No matter how skillful the defense, the forward momentum of the Allies remained unstoppable. The human element magnified the effect. American truck drivers, engineers, and logistics officers worked in concert with commanders on the ground. Convoys moved in precisely timed ways, sometimes spanning hundreds of miles, yet always arriving with the correct supplies for each unit. Command posts coordinated deliveries in real time, adjusting for frontline consumption and unforeseen obstacles. German reconnaissance observed the network in awe. It was not merely the speed of the advance that shocked them, but the precision, coordination, and redundancy built into every operation. One notable example occurred near the Moselle River, where German commanders anticipated that limited bridge crossings would delay Patton's armored units. Yet within 48 hours, Bailey bridges had been erected, roads repaired, and fuel and ammunition delivered directly to forward tanks. Tanks crossed the river at full strength, supported by artillery units, whose shells had arrived hours in advance. German officers, expecting hesitation and disarray, were confronted with an unstoppable, well-supplied force. The magnitude of this logistical achievement began to have strategic repercussions beyond individual engagements. German command structures, which had relied on exploiting enemy supply limitations, now faced continuous pressure across multiple fronts. Every defensive position that was expected to stall the Americans was overwhelmed, not through superior firepower alone, but because the Americans had already neutralized the limiting factor: logistics. Supplies arrived faster than they could be destroyed. Units advanced faster than they could be countered. In essence, German commanders realized, almost simultaneously across multiple sectors, that they were facing a fundamentally new challenge. The Americans were not just winning battles, they were sustaining victories in a manner that made retreat or counteroffensive increasingly futile. By mid-September, the operational tempo had reached a crescendo. German field reports described entire divisions moving without pause, as if the enemy were powered by an inexhaustible source. The acknowledgement was unambiguous: Logistical mastery, not just tactical skill, was dictating the pace and outcome of operations. This mounting realization among German commanders set the stage for the decisive phase of the campaign, where the full weight of American logistical efficiency would directly determine the collapse of German defensive operations and the simultaneous success of three advancing armies. As September progressed, the operational impact of sustained logistics became unmistakable. The U.S. 1st, 3rd, and 9th Armies were no longer merely advancing. They were pressing forward with a speed and coordination that left German commanders scrambling. Orders from the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht reflected mounting frustration. Reinforcements were diverted, defensive positions hastily reinforced, yet the Americans continued to move with a momentum that appeared impervious to attrition. Every calculated delay assumed by the Germans was neutralized by the relentless flow of supplies. The Third Army, under General Patton, epitomized the power of logistical foresight. Known for rapid armored advances, Patton's units relied entirely on continuous delivery of fuel and ammunition. Convoys moved day and night, guided by meticulously calculated routes that avoided choke points, while mobile repair units ensured that vehicles remained operational despite constant wear. German reconnaissance reports repeatedly documented columns stretching for miles, an unbroken chain of material and manpower that seemed to anticipate enemy attempts at disruption. Patton's advance became a psychological as well as tactical weapon. The certainty of supply translated directly into operational confidence. Simultaneously, the 1st and 9th Armies moved along parallel axes, synchronized through Eisenhower's overarching command structure. Depot placement, road repair, and pipeline networks ensured that frontline units were consistently resupplied. Artillery units could fire continuously. Infantry units could advance without pause. Armor could maneuver freely, unburdened by supply shortages. From the German perspective, these movements were unprecedented. Each attempt to establish defensive lines was met not with hesitation, but with a fully provisioned, fully reinforced attack. The operational tempo left German units reactive, unable to predict or counter the Americans' next move effectively. German officers noted this astonishment in reports. Supplies arrive faster than destruction. The enemy's tempo is unrelenting, impossible to anticipate the next advance. The language conveyed both disbelief and alarm. The traditional assumption that overstretched forces would falter under logistical strain had been decisively disproven. American armies advanced across multiple sectors simultaneously, supported by a network that was resilient, redundant, and remarkably adaptive. Even when bridges were destroyed or roads cratered, the Americans repaired, rerouted, and pressed forward with minimal delay. Key battles illustrated the turning point. Near Metz, German forces anticipated slowing Patton's armored columns by controlling river crossings. Yet, within hours, Bailey bridges were erected, fuel was delivered, and tanks crossed at full operational strength. At the same time, artillery units fired continuously, supported by ammunition transported from depots dozens of kilometers behind the front. The German assumption that infrastructure destruction would limit American movement was shattered. Reports described stunned commanders observing as an enemy that should have been delayed advance without hesitation, sustained by an invisible machine of supply. The strategic implications were profound. German divisions, already stretched thin, could not maintain continuous resistance when facing fully supplied and coordinated attacks on multiple fronts. Even when attempting counterattacks, they found that American units had already repositioned or reinforced, preempting any disruption. Logistics had become an operational weapon in its own right. The continuous supply of fuel, food, ammunition, and repair parts dictated the pace of engagement and shaped the battlefield long before combat began. By mid-September, the German command's realization was complete. The Americans were capable of sustaining 3 full armies simultaneously across vast distances in contested territory. This logistical dominance rendered conventional defensive strategies largely ineffective. Morale among German troops began to erode as the inevitability of sustained American pressure became clear. Frontline units witnessed the same reality repeatedly: trucks, convoys, and supply depots arriving faster than they could be destroyed, engineers repairing damage within hours, and soldiers moving forward with unbroken strength. The climax of this phase of the campaign was not marked by a single battle, but by cumulative operational mastery. The German command's inability to interdict the supply lines, combined with the Americans' coordination and resilience, culminated in a strategic collapse of German defensive plans in northern France. The turning point was clear. American logistics had transformed from a supporting element into a decisive force, enabling sustained offensive operations, overwhelming enemy positions, and setting the stage for the liberation of occupied France. This realization by German commanders, that the Allies' operational success was driven as much by logistics as by firepower, now led directly into the aftermath of the campaign, where the consequences of sustained supply would reshape both tactical and strategic realities for the German military. The consequences of American logistical mastery quickly became evident across northern France. German defensive lines, already strained by prior defeats, were systematically outpaced. 1st, 3rd, and 9th Armies advanced continuously, capturing key towns, river crossings, and transport hubs with a speed that German commanders had considered impossible. Supply lines, maintained by the Red Ball Express and an intricate network of depots and pipelines, ensured that every advancing unit received exactly what it required: fuel for tanks, ammunition for artillery, food for soldiers, without interruption. Quantitatively, the scale of the operation was staggering. Reports from the U.S. Army noted that thousands of trucks delivered tens of thousands of tons of supplies daily. Over 6,000 vehicles operated continuously in convoy systems, often covering hundreds of kilometers of damaged roads each day. Fuel consumption alone was immense. Armored divisions required millions of liters, yet pipelines, tankers, and resupply points consistently met demand. Ammunition stockpiles were rotated and replenished in forward positions before German forces could target them, allowing continuous artillery support that maintained relentless pressure on enemy positions. German forces, in contrast, faced the cumulative impact of disrupted logistics. Retreating divisions were undersupplied, and counteroffensive attempts faltered due to shortages of fuel and munitions. The German High Command, OKW, documented reports from field commanders noting the unprecedented speed of enemy movement and the inexhaustible nature of their supply lines. Even elite units, previously considered capable of mounting significant resistance, struggled to respond effectively. Morale began to decline as soldiers witnessed the Americans advance with a consistency that suggested inevitability. The human toll was compounded by operational strain. German troops, already demoralized by the Normandy defeat, now faced the psychological burden of an enemy that not only outmaneuvered them on the battlefield but did so without apparent logistical limitation. Commanders were forced to abandon positions preemptively, often without engaging in sustained combat, simply because they could not match the speed and endurance of the American advance. Every tactical calculation, where to place reserves, how to time a counterattack, was rendered less effective by the Americans' ability to maintain momentum through supply. Infrastructure captured or repaired by the Allies further exacerbated German difficulties. Ports such as Cherbourg, initially heavily damaged, were brought into operation within days of capture, allowing for rapid unloading of reinforcements and material. Bridges destroyed by retreating German forces were rebuilt with modular Bailey bridge systems, restoring critical arteries of movement. Roads, previously cratered by Allied air attacks, were cleared and reinforced. These efforts effectively nullified the Germans' defensive strategies, which had relied on infrastructure destruction to slow the Allied advance. From a strategic standpoint, the aftermath of this operational feat had immediate and far-reaching effects. German defensive planning, once predicated on slowing enemy advances through attrition and infrastructure sabotage, became increasingly reactive. Their operational tempo lagged behind the Americans at every turn, forcing repeated withdrawals and reallocation of resources. Commanders could no longer rely on standard calculations of supply limitations to predict enemy movement, and every misjudgment carried greater consequences. The cumulative effect of continuous resupply and strategic foresight created a cascading advantage. As American forces pressed forward, liberated towns provided staging areas for additional supply depots, further extending the reach of logistics. German defensive positions, intended to delay an attrit, were bypassed or neutralized, demonstrating that the battlefield had shifted from a contest of firepower alone to one of sustained operational endurance. The logistical triumph achieved by the Americans not only enabled immediate tactical success, but also set the stage for the broader collapse of German defensive operations across northern France, leading directly into the final consolidation of Allied advances in the weeks that followed. As the U.S. armies pressed deeper into France, the full strategic implications of sustained logistics became undeniable. German forces, forced into constant retreat, struggled to regroup or mount effective counterattacks. The destruction of key infrastructure, bridges, railways, and roads had been intended to stall the Americans, yet every obstacle was rapidly repaired or bypassed. The Red Ball Express and supporting convoys delivered fuel, ammunition, and rations with such precision that frontline units maintained operational strength despite the distance from ports and supply depots. The psychological effect on German troops and commanders was profound. Reports described officers stunned at the enemy's inexhaustible resources, and soldiers witnessing columns of trucks advancing, as if by magic. Confidence in previously reliable defensive strategies began to erode. The notion that overstretched armies would falter due to supply limitations was no longer viable. Morale weakened further, as each failed counterattack confirmed the Americans' operational superiority. In multiple sectors, German commanders were compelled to abandon planned defensive lines, recognizing that the momentum of U.S. forces could not be halted by conventional means alone. The numbers illustrate the scale of this logistical achievement. By mid-September 1944, thousands of trucks had transported over 12,000 tons of fuel and supplies daily across northern France. Forward depots stored sufficient reserves to sustain operations for weeks, while mobile repair teams ensured that vehicles and equipment remained combat-ready. Artillery units fired without interruption, armored divisions maneuvered freely, and infantry divisions advanced without the delays that typically accompany extended supply lines. The operational tempo made it clear that logistics had become as decisive as tanks or artillery in determining battlefield outcomes. German strategic planning suffered as a result. Attempts to predict and exploit supply bottlenecks repeatedly failed. Divisions intended to intercept advancing Americans were outpaced, defensive fortifications were bypassed, and counteroffensive operations collapsed due to insufficient fuel or ammunition. The repeated inability to disrupt supply lines forced the German High Command into a purely reactive posture. Every move was an attempt to respond to events already dictated by the Americans' logistical efficiency. Beyond immediate tactical consequences, this sustained logistical success reshaped operational thinking for the remainder of the European campaign. Commanders on both sides recognized that the pace and sustainability of operations were determined not solely by weaponry or manpower, but by the organization and execution of supply networks. The lessons learned would influence subsequent Allied advances across Belgium, the Netherlands, and eventually into Germany itself. German planners, meanwhile, were forced to confront the limitations of their own logistical capabilities, a critical factor that contributed to the collapse of resistance in Western Europe. By the end of September 1944, the Allied armies had not only liberated vast swathes of French territory, but had demonstrated a paradigm shift in warfare. Logistics, when executed with precision, discipline, and foresight, could become the decisive weapon on the battlefield. The Germans' stunned reaction, their reactive strategies, and their diminishing morale all stemmed from a fundamental truth: the American advance was not merely an exercise in firepower, but a masterclass in operational sustainability. The stage was now set for reflection. The campaign's enduring lessons about logistics, human ingenuity, and the nature of modern warfare would echo long after the last battles were fought, shaping both strategy and history itself. The campaign across northern France in 1944 stands as a testament to a truth often overlooked in conventional histories of war. Logistics is as decisive as strategy, tactics, or firepower. The Americans' ability to sustain 3 full armies simultaneously, across hundreds of kilometers of contested terrain, redefined the possibilities of modern warfare. This was not a product of luck or chance, but of meticulous planning, human ingenuity, and the disciplined execution of a complex supply network. Soldiers, engineers, truck drivers, and officers alike became part of an invisible machinery that shaped the battlefield. The Red Ball Express, forward depots, fuel pipelines, and mobile repair units together created a system that enabled relentless operational tempo. Tanks moved without pause, artillery fired without delay, and infantry advanced with the certainty that resources would always meet them. For the German commanders observing these operations, the advance was not merely unexpected, it was psychologically disorienting. The reliability and scale of American logistics challenged their assumptions about the limits of warfare, exposing vulnerabilities in a system predicated on attrition and delayed supply. Yet beyond strategy and psychology, the campaign illustrates a broader lesson about human endeavor in times of conflict. Logistical mastery required cooperation, discipline, and foresight on a massive scale. The American success was not derived from a single technological innovation or a moment of brilliance, but from the coordinated effort of thousands of individuals executing a shared vision. Each truck driver, each engineer, each planner played a role in sustaining the forward momentum that determined the outcome of battles before they were even fought. In historical terms, the liberation of northern France demonstrated that modern warfare demands not only courage and firepower, but also the unseen infrastructure that enables those qualities to be applied effectively. Logistics became a weapon in its own right, capable of shaping outcomes, dictating tempo, and determining the fate of armies. For the German commanders who witnessed it, the lesson was stark. Underestimating the organizational and industrial capacity of the enemy can be as lethal as any miscalculated assault. As the Allies pressed forward and Germany's defensive lines continued to crumble, the enduring significance of this campaign became clear. It was not only a triumph of arms, but a triumph of planning, coordination, and human ingenuity, a reminder that in war, the most decisive victories are often won not just by those on the front lines, but by the invisible forces sustaining them. With this understanding, the story of American logistics in 1944 remains a benchmark in military history, shaping both the outcome of World War II and the principles of modern operational warfare.